With us today, we have Professor Haim Mendelson. Welcome. Professor Mendelson is the Kleiner, Perkins, Caulfield, and Byers Professor of Electronic Business and Commerce and Management at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. His work has been published in many leading journals, and he's been a consultant to leading high technology companies, stock exchanges, financial services companies, management consulting companies, and industrial companies. Professor Mendelson, what a lineup that was. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we're really looking forward to today's session.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's great to be with all of you. Today we're going to discuss business models and disruption. And the plan of the webinar is, first of all, to talk about what is a disruption. It's a concept that people talk a lot about, but very often don't define. So we'll define what it is. We'll see how it relates to the concept of a business model, and we'll then go into what is a business model. We'll put together a framework for thinking about business models. We'll apply the framework. We'll think about some of the key trade-offs in designing a business model. We'll then talk about a number of different types of business models with a number of applications. And we'll discuss how some of these examples have resulted in a response to disruptions. So that's the plan. So let's start with that plan. So basically, what is disruption is kind of our first question. And essentially, disruption is a change in technology, in customer preferences, in competition, or in regulation that necessitates a major business model change. So that's how business models and disruptions are related to one another. So whenever we have a big change that requires a big change in our business model, we call this a disruption. And if we think about the business model as a house, a disruption is like an earthquake that requires us to redesign the house. Sometimes part of the house, sometimes we need to rebuild the entire house. So what is a business model? Because when I define disruption, I use the concept of a business model. So again, if we go to the analogy of a house, before you build the house, hopefully what you want to have is a blueprint that describes the architectural structure of that house. A business model is a very high-level architectural structure that describes the structure of a business. So it's essentially a theory or a blueprint of the business itself. And just like a mathematical model or a high-level blueprint, it is stylized. It focuses on the key elements of the business model and the relationships among them. It doesn't describe everything. It just goes at a very high level. The business model concept is used both for startups, where it provides an organizing framework for building the business model, or for established companies that are facing a disruption and they need to rethink their business model and redesign the business model, and to some extent go a bit into startup mode. So both of these are cases where we really need to think carefully about our business model. And as I said, it's a little bit like the architectural, high-level architectural blueprint of a house, and it has three key points. The first three key elements. The first element is the value creation model that describes who are our customers, how we're going to create value for these customers, and how we're going to deliver that value to them. So that focuses on the customer. The second room of that house is the profit model that describes how we're going to extract some of the value that we create in the process of running the business. It describes the revenue model, the cost structure, and the key drivers of profitability. The roof of the house is the logic of the business model. which basically describes what our goal is. Sometimes we put more emphasis on profits. Sometimes we put more emphasis on growth. Sometimes we have a non-profit, so we have a totally different objective. We want to save the planet. All of these are goals that drive the logic of the business. And the logic of the business basically answers the question, why do we think that we're going to achieve that goal? So when we design a business model, we think about how we're going to create value. We think about how we're going to extract some of that value. We think about the interaction between these two elements, and we think about how that interaction is going to help us achieve our objectives. So these are kind of the key things we think about when we build a business model. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that there's typically tension between the value creation model and the profit model. And that tension is, people tend to not focus on it, and it's actually pretty important to think about it when we build a business model, because we need to realize that some of the decisions that we make that create more value may actually hurt our profit. An interesting example of that is the example of Facebook. So when Facebook was established, they kind of described what they're trying to do. And so this is kind of, this picture is actually a picture that appeared on the Facebook hoodie that people had in the year 2010. So they would wear a hoodie, and inside that hoodie, they would have this picture that describes the value creation model of Facebook. So the idea is that we want to make the internet more open and connected, using essentially the stream here, which is the news feed and the social graph and the platform that enables outside developers to tap into our system. So this is the way Facebook described itself. And importantly, they said, you know, our value creation model is really almost perfectly aligned with our profit model. And in fact, when Facebook was first established at Harvard University, it's one of the few startups that started at Harvard, not at Stanford. What they did was they made sure that they can actually make money before they grow. So basically, they made sure that each time they added a server in another university, they made sure they're going to have enough advertising revenue to cover the cost of that server. So from their perspective, they thought about the value creation model and the profit model together. And one could argue that the two elements of the business model are very well aligned. But of course, over time, as it turned out, there are some cracks in that alignment. And essentially what happens is that because Facebook's profit model is based on advertising, so Facebook funds itself through advertising revenue. What happens is that they have to think not only about their users, they need to think as carefully and sometimes more carefully about the paying customers who are the advertisers. So they have to design the business model so that there will be a high level of engagement, so that people will stay engaged with the platform, so that people will come back to Facebook. And indeed, they've managed to keep a very high level of engagement over a very long period of time, because that was a metric that they focused on. But if you want people to be engaged, the question is, how do we do that? And we measure all kinds of metrics that drive engagement. And as it turns out, content which is more polarizing, content that makes people angry, content that makes people agree with more extreme views, tends to be more engaging in that sense than content which is a little more friendly. And the result of that is that when you just apply the Facebook algorithms, what you tend to do is really amplify some negative trends. So the result of that is that actually to make money to support the profit model, what we're going to do is actually adjust the value creation model so that users will not be as well off as they would be without that profit model. And the reason is, of course, that the profit model is driven by the advertisers and the value creation model is driven by the users. So we really need to satisfy the advertisers, and that's not the same as satisfying the users. So the result of that is tension between the value creation model and the profit model. Now, if you think about so people say, Mark Zuckerberg, is he an angel? Is he the devil? We need to take that back and kind of think about what is the business model, why are they doing that? And in the case of Facebook, they have a very effective business model from a profitability point of view. What you see on this chart is the average revenue per user per quarter for Facebook, where the blue bars are averages in the United States. You can see that in the fourth quarter, which is the peak quarter, Facebook is making more than $60 per user per quarter. So think about this. They make, if you think about Netflix is making approximately in revenue about $48 per user per quarter. So Facebook is making on average on each user more money than Netflix is making. And Netflix has to make all of these investments in creating content and spend billions and billions of dollars on new content all the time. And Facebook, by just putting people together, is able to create much more money. So basically, Facebook is executing a business model that calls for satisfying the advertisers, because that's where the revenue is coming from. And it's not the only business model that can work for content and interaction. So compare that to a company called Substack, where content providers can publish their content and create a direct connection with their users. And in the case of a Substack, you can see in this picture their growth. So it's growing. The growth rate is very nice, at least until the end of 22. We don't have data following 2022. And the way it works then is that you can subscribe to a content provider and they can send you some content for free. And if you want, you pay them typically $5 a month or $10 a month, and they send you premium content only for subscribers, and Substack is taking a percentage of that revenue. So this is a business model where there is a much better alignment between what the value creation model tells us to do for the users and what the profit model tells us to do for our profits. There's very good alignment because our paying customers are exactly the users for whom we're creating the value. But if you look at the numbers here, so this is in thousands. So by the end of 2022, they managed to get 2 million paying subscribers. Compare that to Facebook, that has 3 billion users that generate revenue. So you have to make a choice. When you build your business model, you can choose between the Facebook business model, free to the users, but less alignment, or the Substack business model, paying users, great alignment, but the numbers are much smaller. And what Facebook is doing essentially is selecting the free business model. And that's one of the things that makes it most profitable. So when we select our business model, we need to think carefully about the trade-off between value creation and profit and where we want to be. And it's up to us to make that decision. Some companies start in one way and go to the other as a result of disruption. And a good example of that is Netflix. So Netflix started as a company where you rent DVDs and you pay a subscription. So just like Substack is a subscription model, and it creates great alignment between the users and the company. because if the user doesn't like the content, they quit. So everything is driven by the value that we create for the users. And you can see in this chart the growth of the number of DVD subscribers that Netflix had. When it started, it was only in the United States. So by the end of 2010, the number grew to approximately 18 million subscribers, which at the time was considered a great number. Now, of course, late of the first years of the 20th century, gradually we've seen an increasing emphasis on streaming, and that presented a potential disruption for Netflix. And what you see in this chart, I expanded the time frame, and you can see on the left, the brown bars represent the number of DVD subscribers, which peaked in 2011, and starting in 2009, roughly, Netflix started providing to its users also streaming content, which initially was provided for free and then became paid content. And you can see in 2011 kind of the transition from an emphasis on DVDs and an emphasis on streaming. So this is what a technology-driven disruption looks like, right? So what we see here is a big change in the business model from one that's based on distribution centers, U.S. Postal Office service, physical DVDs, to one that's based on everything is digital. We start creating our own content, and you can see that the number of DVD subscribers is going down sharply. And during that period of disruption, big business model change, what happened to Netflix was that it was almost destroyed, because the transition from one model to the other model was not smooth, and to kind of at the point where they decided to separate the two models, they dramatically raised the price of that most of their users had to pay, and they lost a lot of users. So it took them a year or two to kind of figure out how to stabilize the business model. They've managed to do that, and you can see the blue bars kind of rising very nicely. And you can also see the green bars. They started as part of that process. Once you have streaming technology, you can actually expand the business model to other countries, initially to specific countries, and then to the rest of the world. And this picture ends in 2019, right? So Netflix became the streaming giant, the leader of the streaming-based business model. And let's look at what happened later. So you can see this chart kind of takes us from 2013 to the present, and you can see the number of users, the subscribers is growing very nicely, but then it's becoming flat. It's actually growing more than nicely during the pandemic, but then it flattens out. And in fact, there was actually a decline in the number of subscribers in the United States. So at the end of 2022, Netflix decided to change its business model again and to switch from a business model that's based only on subscriptions to a business model that mixes subscriptions and advertising. And as we've seen before, this has big implications for the way we think about the business, because with an advertising-based business model, we need to satisfy not only the subscribers, but also the advertisers. Today, the effect is small. The revenue they have from advertising in 2022 is something like $500 million, but it's expected to increase quickly. And at that point, they will face the same dilemmas that we have talked about for Facebook. Let's talk briefly about the business model development process. How do we develop a business model? And let's think about going to space. So in the United States, kind of the agency that opened up space to the world, at least in the United States, was NASA. Essentially government-funded entity. that developed the technology and a kind of space exploration and so on. And a slogan that was formed when they had problems with Apollo 13 was failure is not an option. So for NASA, whenever they sent a satellite, they kind of worked very hard to make sure in advance that everything will go right. Of course, it didn't always happen, but the idea was we are putting a lot of effort to make sure that nothing will go wrong, because failure can be catastrophic. And let's compare that to the approach which is taken by SpaceX. By the way, you see here how much money NASA was getting. I started this in 2006. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of funding for NASA to the space missions that they had then, but I wanted to start in 2006, and the reason is that I want to compare them to SpaceX, which got its initial funding in 2006. And of course, SpaceX has a very different approach. And the approach of SpaceX is that failure is the only option. It's not that failure is not an option, failure is the only option. And basically, if you compare NASA's funding to SpaceX funding, what you see on the black chart is from 2006 to this year, the cumulative funding that went to NASA, which is roughly about $20 billion a year. And what you see in the green bars, which are hardly seen here, is the funding that went to SpaceX. So you can see that SpaceX has used, and in 2006, you can't even see it in this chart, but it's a very small number. But you see here that SpaceX funding was only a fraction, a very small fraction of the funding of NASA. But you could argue this chart is unfair because some of the money that came to SpaceX was not from people who funded it, but came from NASA itself. So let's add to the NASA numbers, to the SpaceX numbers, the money that they got from NASA. And you see it in this chart. So the green bars are funding for SpaceX, and the small, you can hardly see them, the brown additions to the chart are the amounts of money that went from NASA to SpaceX. So you can see that SpaceX, a very lean operation. And of course, they have a very different approach. Their approach is that failure is the only option. We fail and fail and fail, and by failing, we create the information that enables us to develop our product and our business model until we succeed. And a good example is their most recent major launch. And you see here the beginning of the launch of their current product, which is a Starship. So Starship is kind of the space. So there's a rocket, and then there is the actual capsule, and that's the one that's going to go to Mars. By the way, it's going to serve them before they go to Mars to ship a lot of satellites to Earth, and it has, to orbit, and it has a very large number of it can take a lot of those satellites, so it dramatically increases the profitability of the company. In April of this year, they had a major launch, kind of the first major test launch of this combination. And you can see they started, and then it went out, and essentially what you see here is what they call rapid unscheduled disassembly, or RUD. In short, RUD means that it blew up, right? So the spaceship, the whole thing blew up. And it's interesting to see the reaction of SpaceX employees who are kind of following what happened. And what you see here, they are kind of celebrating, they're cheering up, and they're so happy and the spaceship blew up. Why are they so happy? And in the same event, you could actually see, we don't have it here, Elon Musk, he's smiling, he's happy. And why are they happy? Because the failure gave them a lot of information that increases the likelihood that their next launch will be successful. So the approach that SpaceX is taking is an approach that's based on failing to learn. And typically when we develop a new business model, we have to assume that it's so new that we don't really know for sure whether or not it will be successful. And as a result of that, we need to plan for these failures as learning events. We need to iterate on the business model, test it out, systematically test element by element of the business model, and that's how we create a viable business model. Let's look at a business model types. I call them archetypes. There are many types of business models in the world, but there are 4 types that cover a significant percentage of many of the business models that we can actually see in action. And I'm going to show it to you by looking at the same industry. Same industry, you have multiple business models, and all of them can be successful. And I'm going to use the lodging industry. And why did I choose the lodging industry? Because actually in the lodging industry, you have large chains like Marriott, which combine many different business models. So within the same company, you can actually have multiple business models. And each brand of Marriott, there are about 30 brands of Marriott. Each of the brands of Marriott actually represents a totally different business model. So what they have is basically a segmentation of the market into multiple business models, which have multiple value creation models that attract different types of customers and have different profit markets. The first brand I want to look at is the second one in this picture, is Ritz-Carlton. And basically, Ritz-Carlton, what you see here is the website of Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, which is just a few miles from Stanford. And Ritz-Carlton is a luxury brand. And the lowest price room you can get during this period here in Ritz-Carlton is $700, but actually it goes up dramatically. So you can get a room for $700, $800, $2,000, $4,000. And the question is, why do people pay $4,000, $2,000 for a room? They basically pay for a used bed. That's what they're getting. So are people willing to pay so much? The reason they're willing to pay so much is really a key element of the Ritz-Carlton business model, which was invented about 70 years ago when they started, before they had computers, and they decided that what they're going to do is base their business model on what I call customer intimacy, which means that we deliver the best solutions to specific customers or customer segments by tailoring our products or services to satisfy unique or highly targeted customer needs. And how do they do that? So basically, they did early on what most hotel chains do today using computers, which is to basically record the preferences of their customers and I'm looking here at the questions. I see these are technical questions. I'm not going to address them. Yeah, it's all technical questions, but if people have questions, then I'll try to address them if they kind of fit in. So the basic idea, we record information about our customers, and we use that information to give them increasingly better quality of service. So for example, historically, the first time you went to a Ritz-Carlton, they would give you 3 types of cookies. And in the morning, they would watch which cookie did you eat. And they would record which cookies you ate. So now they know which cookies you like. And the next time you go to Ritz-Carlton, they give you just the cookies that you like, because now we know what you like. If you want to go to a certain type of restaurant, you ask, well, how do I find a Japanese restaurant? They record that. The next time you go to any Ritz-Carlton, they'll say, well, we have a great Japanese restaurant in this city. Here it is. If you rearrange the room, they will actually record how you rearrange the room, and they'll try to match it next time you go there, unless it's a really unusual way to rearrange a room. So the idea is that we collect information about our customers, and as a result of that, we can give them high quality service. As a result of the quality of service, the customers come back to us. When they come back, they give us yet more information, so we can give them even better service. So what happens is that frequency drives information, which drives quality of service, which drives loyalty, which drives frequency. So we have a virtuous cycle of customer intimacy. This is the logic of customer intimacy that we see in many, many different types of business models. Let me go to another Marriott business model. Actually, the first one of their luxury brand is called Edition. So Edition is kind of a design-based hotel, which is an example of what I call a product, or in this case, service leadership. And basically, it's a business model that was designed. The hotels are designed by a famous designer, and that designer tries to make them give you a unique experience, exquisite looking hotel, and the idea here is to impress you with the quality of the hotel itself. You see here, kind of said, the world's hottest hotel brand. So that's kind of what product leadership is about. It's kind of interesting when the designer was asked, what is so special about Edition? Why do we need to pay so much for it? He said, what distinguishes Apple phones from everybody else? You can't quite put your finger on it, but you're in a special place, right? So a little bit like the Apple of hotels. And Apple, of course, is another example of a product leadership. And a definition, if we go to the definition of product leadership, we create value for customers by generating a stream of products or service innovation. So it's the innovation of the service that drives customers to us. The next kind of archetype is one that I call operational excellence, where we deliver a standard product or service that meets our customers' needs at a low cost, or it provides superior functional performance. And in the case of Marriott, this is done by their Fairfield brand. So the Fairfield brand, the idea here is that it's a very functional hotel, but the idea is that we give you functionality and low cost. And we achieve that through standardization. So there's a standard template essentially that's used to design the hotel. The hotels don't have a, the human-based customer service is minimal. You can buy things at the vending machine. There is a standard breakfast buffet that you can get. It's reliable, clean, functional, low price. The idea is if that's what you're looking for, Fairfield is for you. And what you can see here that what they advertise is the beauty of simplicity. It's simple, it's functional, it does the job at low cost, and standardization is a key feature that enables us to do that. The fourth archetype that I want to talk about is value chain coordination, where we create value by coordinating different elements of the value chain. So we have different components of the value chain, And what we do is coordinate them. And the simplest example of that, there are many examples, but I'm going to go with the simplest one, which is Airbnb. So in the case of Airbnb, it's a marketplace. So a marketplace is the simplest form of value chain coordination. And of course, Airbnb does not own the properties. It simply coordinates the value chain. It matches hosts and guests and enables them to work, enables the hosts to provide spare space that they have or space that they bought in some cases where you have a professional host to the guest, and it enables the guests to get the type of space that they're looking for as an alternative to a hotel. And if we kind of think about, in the case of Airbnb, how do they create value? So because the Airbnb, because it coordinates hosts and guests, it really has two types of customers, and it needs to satisfy both of them to work. To satisfy the hosts, what they do is basically the hosts get extra revenue from resources that otherwise would stay idle. So the value proposition for the host is clear. The value proposition for the guest varies. So if you look at the results of surveys of why people go to stay at their Airbnb, the number one reason they do it is less expensive compared to a comparable hotel room. It's not always less expensive. Some Airbnbs are very, very expensive, but on average, they're about 30% less expensive than a comparable hotel room, and that's what attracts most people to Airbnb. The second factor is location. So hotels, by their economics, requires them to be close to conference centers, places where lots of people stay, and the hotel itself is a building that accommodates hundreds, sometimes more people. So as a result of that, they're concentrated in specific parts of a city, and Airbnb is spread throughout the city wherever people have space. So as a result of that, if you look for a specific location, which is not a conference center, not a central location, what will happen is that you're much more likely to find that location on Airbnb than in a hotel. And that's an advantage that a lot of people prefer. And then the experience, if it's a great experience, sometimes the host helps you, shows you the city around, and so on and so forth. Easy to use. Sometimes you want to have your own kitchen, you want to stay in a house, you come with the family, uniqueness of the units. So all of these are factors that the business model enables you to do. When we think about the uniqueness of the units, Airbnb is increasingly emphasizing that. So you can find all kinds of spaces on Airbnb which are unlikely to be available in a hotel. And you can even find an igloo on Airbnb. In this list, there are 11 igloos that I identified, and about half of them have Wi-Fi, if you're interested. And one of the key advantages of the value chain coordination business model compared to a standard hotel is that it's much more scalable because you don't have physical resources. Airbnb doesn't have to own these properties. So when you get started, this is a problem that you need to address. And in the course, in the online course, we actually spend some time thinking about how to address that problem. So you can see early on, Airbnb is increasing, but of course, Marriott is much, much bigger in terms of the amount of money that people pay to stay there in the aggregate. But by 2017, Airbnb matched Marriott. And by 2019, it exceeded Marriott by far, right? Because of the advantages of its business model. And it's interesting to actually look at the effect of a disruption on the operation of that business model. And the obvious disruption that happened following 2019 was COVID-19, right? So COVID-19 caused a major disruption to the travel industry. and it affected negatively both Marriott and Airbnb. And you can see here, 2020, the gross bookings on Airbnb fall sharply, the gross bookings on Marriott fall sharply. If you compare that to what happened in the industry at large, you can see that it was even worse for the industry at large in terms of the number of people that went to hotels. But the interesting thing is that Airbnb is recovering much, much faster than Marriott. And the reason is that it has a much more resilient business model. During COVID-19 itself, during the disruption, Airbnb was able to switch the type of space that was available from central city locations to other types of locations, because basically Airbnb doesn't have to build those spaces. It's just that you have different types of hosts that satisfy demand that evolves as a result of the disruption. In the case of Marriott, of course, they can't instantaneously build a new hotel where people want to go. So the result of that, they have to lay off people. They can't respond. And you can see that following the disruption, so hopefully COVID-19 is over by now. So you can see Airbnb going up very, very quickly, and Marriott and the rest of the industry recovering, but much more slowly, because they have to hire people, they have to train them. It's not that easy to shift the types of hotels that you want to have. So it's a much, much slower and more painful process. And again, that's reflected in the economics of Airbnb. You can see here the number of nights booked or on Airbnb in the blue line, and the gross booking value on Airbnb on the brown line. Of course, there's a lot of seasonality, so you can see it going up and down within each year, but the general trend is way up, much more than actually it continues to increase faster than it did before the disruption, as a result of having a pretty good business model, which is the value chain coordination business model. And so this is an example of how previously we talked about the technology disruption. Here we have an example of how a disruptive event, in this case COVID-19, affects the business model. And Airbnb has not only responded to COVID-19, but is now changing its business model to a business model that focuses much more on people who want to work from anywhere. So work from home is a phenomenon that's decreasing, but it's not going down to zero. More and more people work from many, many more different locations, and Airbnb is adjusting its business model to accommodate that, and that's reflected in their financials. And again, because it's a value chain coordination business model, it can do it much more effectively than a more traditional business models. Let's look at another example of how technology changes the business model, and I look at another value chain coordination business model, which is called Be My Eyes. So Be My Eyes, essentially it's a network which has users, and the users are people who are blind or are vision impaired. And basically they have an app on their phone, and today they have about 500,000 people using it in that way. So a very large number of people all over the world. And on the other side of the network are volunteers who help them. So if I'm blind and I want to kind of see what shirt I'm wearing, I can point my phone camera to the shirt that I'm looking at, and I'll click on the app, and that will send the image to a person who volunteered to help, one of the 7 million people, and that person will see the shirt and will tell me on the phone, you know, this is a shirt with a striped shirt with blue stripes and white stripes. Is that the shirt you want? And I can say, okay, I actually want another shirt, and I'll point my phone and so on. So it's a value chain coordination business model, or a marketplace which has on one side vision impaired people, on the other side volunteers that use the person's phone as their eyes, and they just tell them, here is what it is. Now, what is the technology disruption? So technology disruption in this case is a large language models, or ChatGPT. So the way it works today, still experimental, they call it Be My AI instead of Be My Eyes. And the way that works is, well, I want to wear that shirt. I point my camera at the shirt, and it takes the image of the shirt, but instead of going to a volunteer, it's going to OpenAI's ChatGPT, which looks at the image and interprets it. And instead of a person saying it, it's the large language model that tells me on the phone, this is a shirt, it has these stripes. So you don't need the 7 million people. Now, of course, you still need them because the large language model is not perfect. But what happens, you can see here, you kind of point your camera, you get the reply, and if you want, you can ask a volunteer, because sometimes it's not clear, sometimes it's not accurate. You can still ask for a volunteer, but what will happen over time is as the application learns more and more, it will be increasingly more accurate. So the number of volunteers that you will need will decline gradually over time. And today, the kind of manual application with volunteers is going to decline because it can be done automatically. So it's a total change in the business model that's driven by a change in technology. Of course, AI technology is affecting many other companies. And since we talked about Facebook, it's kind of interesting to talk about Facebook in that context. So Facebook has made great strides through the use of AI and through the use of large language models. And one of the kind of disruptions that Facebook has faced was the disruption for Apple, where Apple has changed its privacy policies so that they don't automatically share app data with Facebook, which creates a big problem for Facebook. And people have said, Facebook, it's really going to be pretty disruptive to Facebook because most of their users use it on the phone, and they lose that phone data. What are they going to do? And indeed, Facebook, for a period of time, has had a hard time actually adjusting to that change. But it developed AI systems to actually use its own data and data it has available to it much more effectively. And as a result of that, not only have they been able to respond to that change from Apple, they've been able to do better. And in fact, a few days ago, they actually announced their results for the third quarter of 2023. So they had $34 billion of revenue, which is like 4 times Netflix. And it was 23% higher than a year ago. And it did all of that after laying off 22,000 employees. So they managed to do that by using AI and data that they had access to do actually better than they could do with the data that they got directly from Apple's operating system, iOS. The other thing they've done is, of course, reduce their cost dramatically by both traditional means, which are layoffs that we talked about, and using AI tools to improve their own internal productivity. So basically, we can when we reduce cost in traditional ways, the effect is usually not permanent. It's a temporary effect because over a few years, what happens, everything comes back to the way it used to be. But when we reduce cost through the use of technology, in this case, the use of AI, these effects are permanent because the technology is there to help us. And in the case of Facebook, the effect was dramatic. So the combined effect of the layoffs and the use of AI was that expenses as a percent of revenue declined from 80% of revenue a year ago to 59% of revenue in the last quarter. And their profit almost tripled from last year, from $4.4 billion to $11.6 billion, right? And they're continuing to use AI to support their advertisers. Remember, their kind of main paying customers are advertisers. So they use generative AI, their large language model, to actually help, first of all, so they have a system called Advantage Plus. It helps advertisers do better matching for their ads. But now they're going a step further and help them actually create the ads. So what happens here is that they use technology to actually improve their business model and respond, in this case, in a positive way to a technology disruption. Let me look, we have a few questions here, so let me look at the questions. So there's a question about Airbnb, whether COVID was a disruption. So by our definition, COVID was definitely a disruption for Airbnb's business model because it was a big exogenous external event that forced them to change their business model. So they didn't change fundamentally what they do, but they made big changes in their business model. So it's certainly an example of disruption for Airbnb. So there's a question, you have mentioned that you will describe 4 business model archetypes. Will you summarize these later? So later, maybe now, so we can go back and summarize them again. So basically we introduced them through the examples, but this slide summarizes all 4. So the first one is customer intimacy, where we deliver best solutions to specific customer segments through the use of customer data. Product service leadership, where we innovate products or services. Operational excellence, where we reduce cost or increase functionality of a product or service homogeneously for a large number of customers. In value chain coordination, which is what we've seen in the case of Airbnb and Be My Eyes, where what we do is we coordinate elements of the value chain, and a special case of that is a marketplace. So the question I have here is, how has SpaceX developed its business model? Has it been the same from the start? So I think that fundamentally, a SpaceX business model has been based on the idea, and we didn't have time to talk about it, but since we have the question, I'm going to go into it. So the basic idea of the SpaceX business model is to build reusable rockets. And the idea is that if you want to be able to go to Mars and do it in a systematic way, you can't do it if you can use your rockets only once, because that would be like developing, jet service between San Francisco and New York City, where you can use the plane only once. I mean, it's just economically not viable. So the basic idea was to develop a solution where the rockets are reusable. Initially, of course, the rockets were not reusable, so they continued to iterate, drive costs down, create reusable rockets. And the business model has evolved from that to, okay, so how do we use these reusable rockets? Then they added to it a very important element, which is Starlink, which is when we send out these rockets, we have customers that pay us to ship payload to space, but we can always fill them up with our own payload, which are these satellites. They're going to be in space and provide internet service to people who do not otherwise have good internet service. And there are lots of them, there are lots of examples. We won't go into them. So SpaceX, again, we've seen a gradual evolution of the business model. So the question here is Facebook a value chain coordination business model? Absolutely. Facebook is primarily a value chain coordination-based business model, which coordinates, first of all, interactions between users and other users, and between users and content providers, and between users and advertisers. So it's a very complex value chain coordination business model, but it's certainly a good example of that business model. The question is, are these business model archetypes exhaustive? No, they're not. There are many business models that combine these, and there are business models that are outside this list of four. So they're not exhaustive, but they represent a large enough percentage of business models that starting from these give us a good start. So when you look at the business model, you say, okay, this looks to me like the operational excellence, but they do also this and they do also this. So it helps us get started when we think about the business model, but it's certainly not exhaustive. And with that, I think I covered the questions in the Q&A. So in summary, so what have we done? We have looked, first of all, at what is a disruption. We've looked at what is a disruption, and we defined it, and we relate it to the concept of a business model. Then what we've done is ask the question, what is a business model and how is it structured? And we've said, you have to think about it like the high-level architecture of a house, which is the value creation model, the profit model, and the logic, which explains why it's going to work. And we've seen in a few examples how this works. And we've talked about the tension between the value creation model and the profit model. And we've seen that in the case of Facebook. We've looked at how that's kind of solved, but in a way that creates much less revenue in the case of Substack. And we looked at the Netflix disruptions, where they've gradually changed their business models from DVD to streaming, and then from streaming subscription only to streaming with advertising, which is what they're doing now. We then looked at the four business model archetypes that we've reviewed 3 minutes ago, so I want to review them again. And then we looked at a few examples of how technology and how external events kind of force us to change the business model. So these are disruptions that force us to change the business model, and how companies like Airbnb and Facebook have actually responded and have changed their business models. So this is exactly 11 a.m. So I think we managed to cover everything, as well as all the questions that we had. So we've been very productive today. We covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of detail we could go into in the course itself. So thank you very much for participating in the webinar and for asking great questions. And if this is still morning for you, have a great day. If this is evening, have a great evening and night. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor Mendelson, and everyone for being here. You and all your questions and all your interactions is what make these sessions so special. We had someone ask, will the slides or recording be available? The recording will be available, and the slides will be in the recording, so you can view the slides just how they were presented. And so that will be to you within 1 week. If you enjoyed what Professor Mendelson had to say today, you might enjoy our business model innovation course, which is linked in your dashboard, and you can find it on Stanford Online. So you can join us there for an online course. Professor Mendelson, thanks so much. It is morning where we are, so I hope you have a great rest of the day. And everyone else, we're signing off. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.